From the outside, convents were often seen as sanctuaries, peaceful retreats from the corruption of the world, places where holy women devoted themselves to prayer, humility, and service. Their high stone walls, rusted gates, and shuttered windows were interpreted as protection from the chaos of life beyond, but the truth, slowly unearthed by time and testimony, reveals something far darker. Those walls weren't just built to keep the world out. They were designed to trap the vulnerable in. Inside, a different reality unfolded, one never shared in holy hymns or parish newsletters. Girls as young as 12 were led through those gates, many against their will, sent there by families embarrassed by a pregnancy, angered by rebellion, or pressured by religious guilt. They were told the convent would purify them, but what many found was not redemption. It was a prison masquerading as piety. The rules inside were suffocating: no speaking unless spoken to, no letters without permission, no contact with the outside world. In some cases, even the girls' names were taken, replaced with saintly titles to cleanse them of their identity. They didn't belong to their families anymore. They belonged to the convent, to the system. They were told the gates were locked for their protection, but in truth, those locks were about control, because once inside, there was no easy way out. Many girls never saw freedom again. Behind these walls, some were made to scrub floors with toothbrushes, forced into silence for weeks as a form of punishment, or isolated in dark meditation, cells that felt more like solitary confinement. Meals were sparse, beds were cold, compassion was rare, but here's the darkest twist. Many of the nuns enforcing these harsh punishments were once victims themselves, women who had entered the convent under similar pressures years before. Their empathy had been starved out of them. Their trauma hadn't been healed, it had been weaponized. Over time, they adopted the same cruelty they once feared, and so the cycle repeated, quietly, devastatingly. Architecture of these places wasn't accidental. Narrow corridors, thick walls, barred windows. Every stone echoed the message, "You are not free." The convents were designed not for openness, but containment, and not just of people, but of secrets, because what went on inside wasn't just about control. It was about hiding things the church and society didn't want to face: pregnancies, abuse, desperation, spiritual manipulation, and worst of all, disappearances. There are chilling accounts of babies born in silence and taken without record, of young girls who went missing from their beds and were never spoken of again, and when families asked questions, they were met with shame or vague reassurances cloaked in spiritual language. She's found her calling, she's serving God now, she's at peace. But peace was not what lived behind those walls, and yet, this story isn't only about horror, it's about awareness. It's about confronting what institutions tried to bury beneath layers of ritual and reverence. Because to understand the full truth is to finally break those walls down. Not the ones made of stone, but the invisible ones built in our minds that said, "Don't question, just trust." In recent years, survivors have come forward. They've described not only the pain, but the confusion, the gaslighting, the years of believing they were the ones who did something wrong. Many spent decades afraid to speak, because the walls didn't just trap them physically, they trapped their stories. Their confidence, their ability to believe that someone would listen, but someone did, and more people are listening now. These women didn't just escape, they rebuilt. They became teachers, artists, counselors. They wrote books, made documentaries, launched investigations. They turned their trauma into a torch, one bright enough to shine into the darkest corners of forgotten convents. They remind us of a powerful truth: silence protects no one but the oppressor. Obedience, when rooted in fear, becomes a weapon, and walls, no matter how sacred, must never become cages. Today, those once mighty walls are crumbling, literally and figuratively. Some have been turned into museums, others into memorials. Their ruins stand as silent witnesses to what happens when humanity is sacrificed in the name of holiness. And as those stories emerge, so does a new generation of women who vow never again. This history matters, because only when we face what was kept hidden can we begin to build something better, something transparent, compassionate, and truly sacred. Let us not fear the truth. Let us fear a future where it is ignored again. The year was 1903, in the predawn hours. Beneath a heavy sky in rural Missouri, a 17-year-old girl named Lillian Clark stumbled barefoot down a dirt road. Her nightgown was torn, her feet bled with every step, and her breathing came in gasps from both fear and exhaustion. Behind her, nestled on a hill and shrouded in trees, the towering stone silhouette of St. Agatha's Convent loomed in silence. She had done what few others dared. She escaped. Lillian had arrived at the convent 2 years earlier. The official story was that she was unruly. Her father had died in a mining accident. Her mother, unable to afford food or education, was pressured by the local priest to send her daughter away for her own good. St. Agatha's, they said, would discipline her, shape her into a proper young lady. The town believed it was an act of mercy, but Lillian would later say it felt like being buried alive. Inside the convent, Lillian and dozens of other girls were stripped of their clothes, their names, and eventually their voices. Speaking without permission was forbidden. Eye contact with nuns was punished. Letters home were censored or never mailed at all. Food was rationed as a tool of obedience. Infractions were met with isolation, starvation, and in the worst cases, beatings. Lillian had seen girls vanish in the middle of the night, only to return days later, pale and silent, their spirits shattered. Others simply never returned. Some claimed they had run away, but no one ever saw them again. What broke her completely, however, wasn't her own suffering. It was witnessing what happened to a 12-year-old girl named Rose. After whispering to another girl during morning prayer, Rose was taken by 2 sisters and locked in the basement. For 3 days, the others heard nothing but muffled screams and the sound of a whip cracking against flesh. When she was finally brought back upstairs, her face was swollen beyond recognition. Her fingers were bruised and she walked with a limp. She was never the same again. That night, Lillian vowed she would escape and expose the truth. She planned every detail, studied the routine, waited for a foggy night when the gods, usually older nuns, would be most inattentive. She tied bed sheets together, climbed out of a second-story window and ran. She didn't stop running until she collapsed near a creek, where a traveling merchant found her and took her to the sheriff's office in town. At first, no one believed her. A girl covered in dirt, shaking with fear, speaking of beatings and isolation inside a holy place. It sounded like fiction. Some accused her of seeking attention. Others said she was possessed, but there was something about her eyes, wide, haunted, determined, that made one young deputy push for an investigation. What the sheriff's team found when they entered St. Agatha's days later shocked them. Beneath the chapel was a hidden door. It led to a maze of stone cells, bare, windowless, and cold. Each had iron chains bolted to the walls. In one, a whip hung from a rusty nail. In another, a wooden crucifix stood beside a small blood-stained mattress. They found journals locked away in a drawer, some written by former girls, some by the nuns themselves. They documented punishments, fasting schedules, and even corrective methods for disobedience. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. How could such horror exist just beyond their town square, behind a gate they passed every Sunday? The church, fearing scandal, moved swiftly. The convent was closed. The nuns reassigned or retired. No criminal charges were filed. The matter was handled internally. But Lillian wasn't done. She became the first of many to speak out. She told her story publicly, first in local papers, then at universities, women's shelters, and churches. Her courage lit a fire. More girls came forward. More convents were investigated. By 1910, 4 other institutions had been shut down, all connected to similar abuses. Lillian never returned to a normal life. She never married, nor did she seek comfort in the church again. But she became a tireless advocate for young women in abusive institutions. She founded a small home for orphaned girls, where compassion, not control, was the foundation. When she died in 1961, her gravestone reads simply, "She escaped." Then she freed others. Lillian Clark proved that one voice, no matter how small or scared, can break a wall built by centuries of silence. She turned horror into purpose, pain into protection, and left behind a legacy that still inspires survivors to speak their truth. When stories began Emerging of the brutal conditions inside America's forbidden convents, the world was quick to point fingers at the nuns. They were painted as monsters in habits, stone-faced women who inflicted cruelty behind stained glass windows. But as the investigations deepened, as diaries were found and forgotten letters surfaced, another layer of the story came into focus, one far more complex and heartbreaking. Many of those sinister sisters weren't born cruel, they were made that way. Behind the walls of these secluded convents, a cycle of abuse quietly repeated itself for decades. It was silent ritual passed down from generation to generation. The older nuns who administered punishment were often the very girls who had once been on the receiving end of it. They were orphans, castaways, abandoned daughters of poor families, dropped at the convent doorstep with no one to return to. Their only inheritance was silence, obedience, and fear. One of the most chilling accounts came from a woman known as Sister Maria Benedict, whose hidden diary was discovered in 1982 during the renovation of a long, abandoned convent in Vermont. Bound in cracked leather and wrapped in linen, diary contained over 300 pages, written in secret over nearly 20 years. Her first entry, dated 1909, began with just one line: "I was never given a choice." Maria had been placed in the convent at age 8 after her parents died of tuberculosis. The sisters raised her under strict discipline. No speaking out of turn, no questioning orders, no tears. By 14, she was scrubbing floors and memorizing Latin prayers for hours at a time. At 16, she was invited to join the order. Though she wrote it felt more like a life sentence than a calling. She detailed the first time she was ordered discipline, a younger girl who had tried to run away. Her hands trembled as she held the switch. She didn't want to do it, but the Mother Superior stood behind her and whispered, "If you don't, you'll take her place." So she obeyed. That moment shattered her, not just because of the pain she inflicted, but because it marked the day she crossed from victim to perpetrator. And yet, she wrote, "I cried more than the girl I struck, because I saw my old self in her eyes." Maria's entries were full of guilt, confusion, and emotional torment. She confessed that most of the nuns were suffering internally, trapped in a system that trained them to believe obedience equaled holiness. They were taught that questioning authority was rebellion, not just against the convent, but against God. Over time, they lost their ability to feel compassion. Some hardened completely. Others, like Maria, continued living with quiet torment. Her final entry, written just weeks before her disappearance, read, "I forgot how to love. I forgot how to cry. I only remembered the rules. May God forgive me, and may the girls I failed find the peace I never did." Maria's diary became a pivotal piece of evidence in understanding the broader system of institutional abuse. It revealed that cruelty was not always born out of malice. It was often born out of conditioning, fear, and survival. What Maria's story teaches us is that pain has a way of multiplying when left unhealed. That abuse, when institutionalized, can infect even the hearts of those who once knew love. And perhaps most importantly, that no one wakes up one day wanting to become the villain. Often, they were once the victims crying for help, but no one came. This keynote doesn't erase the pain caused by these nuns. It doesn't excuse the abuse, but it helps explain how a system built on silence and submission created generation after generation of wounded women, many of whom wore the very habits that once terrified them. In later years, survivor advocacy groups would adopt a powerful motto inspired by Maria's story: break the cycle, heal the line. Because when one person chooses healing over hurting, honesty over hiding, they change the future for everyone that comes after. Let Maria's voice, written in the margins of history, remind us that institutions must be held accountable, but individuals must also be understood. That cycles of abuse don't end with punishment alone, but with truth, compassion, and the courage to stop repeating what was once done to us. The sisters who inflicted pain were often the ones who had never been given peace. And in their tragic transformation, we find a lesson. If we don't heal what hurt us, we'll become what hurt others. For decades, certain convents across the United States were surrounded by thick stone walls and veils of secrecy. But among the darkest secrets kept within these religious institutions were the hidden pregnancies. a haunting truth buried both literally and figuratively beneath sacred soil. From the 1920s through the 1950s, girls as young as 13 were sent to remote convents for one reason: they were pregnant, and society didn't want to see them. Some were unwed daughters of wealthy families. Others were orphans who had been assaulted by local townsmen, priests, or even by members of the religious orders themselves. Regardless of the cause, these girls were labeled as sinners, shamed for their condition, and sent away to cleanse their souls. But what awaited them behind those convent doors was not healing, it was erasure. These convents operated maternity wings, hidden from the rest of the world, often in basements or back buildings. The girls were made to do heavy labor, scrubbing floors, hauling laundry, and preparing food in silence. Talking about their pregnancies, or even acknowledging them, was strictly forbidden. They were taught to believe that their babies were punishments, and that their pain was necessary for redemption. One of the most chilling testimonies came from a survivor named Joanne Callister, who in 1934 was taken to a convent in rural Michigan after being assaulted by a relative. She was only 15. In her later years, she described the experience. It felt like a tomb. The walls were gray, the rooms were cold, and the nuns watched us like guards in a prison. But the worst part wasn't the punishment. It was pretending my baby didn't exist. Joanne was forced to give birth alone, with no medical assistance, on a stone floor with only a bucket of water beside her. Her baby was taken immediately. She was told it had gone to a better place. She never knew if that meant adoption or something far more tragic. Many girls like Joanne were never allowed to see their babies. Some were told their children had died shortly after birth. But as time passed, evidence began to surface that many of these infants were secretly adopted out, sometimes sold to wealthy families without the mother's knowledge or consent. In other cases, what was discovered was far more horrifying. In the 1960s, during excavation work on an abandoned convent garden in upstate New York, construction workers uncovered a row of small, unmarked graves. Authorities confirmed that the remains belonged to infants. The church issued a public statement claiming the children had died from illness and were respectfully buried. But former residents of the convent told a different story of babies who were born weak from neglect, who died without care, and who were buried without names, without ceremony, and without love. These hidden pregnancies weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systemic effort to control the narrative of purity and punishment, sacrificing truth to maintain the illusion of righteousness. The young girls were silenced, their children vanished, and the institutions that allowed it all continued to operate in the shadows. But the darkness didn't last forever. As the decades passed, brave women began to speak out. Survivors like Joanne formed support groups. Journalists began to investigate. In 1993, a best-selling book titled The Lost Daughters of St. Agnes compiled stories from over 300 women who had endured pregnancies in convents and never saw their babies again. Public outrage grew. Laws were changed. Some former nuns came forward, confessing that they had been forced to lie to girls, to sign forged adoption papers, or even to dispose of the remains of stillborn infants. And in 2001, at age 87, Joanne Callister's lifelong search came to an end. With the help of DNA testing and a private investigator, she was reunited with her son, who had been adopted by a family in Texas and raised under a different name. Their reunion was televised across the nation, and Joanne's quiet words during an interview struck the hearts of millions. They tried to erase us, but love remembers. These hidden pregnancies were tragedies, yes, but they were also the seeds of a powerful movement. Survivors transformed their pain into advocacy. They fought for access to birth records, for acknowledgement from the church, and for justice for the children who never got a name. Let their stories be a lesson to every generation. Secrecy destroys, but truth heals. Shame silences, but courage shouts. And even when the world tries to bury the past, truth will rise. For years, the doors of America's forbidden convents remained shut to the public and to the truth. Behind those heavy wooden doors and beneath the sweeping silence of stained glass windows, unspeakable things occurred. Generations of young women were silenced, their pain buried beneath a veil of spiritual authority and religious obedience. And yet, for far too long, no one said anything. No laws were changed. No justice came. Why did it take so long? Because the enemy wasn't just the system, it was the reverence surrounding it. Convents were seen as sacred. The nuns who ran them were viewed not as fallible humans, but holy figures above reproach. To question them felt like questioning faith itself. And for many families, especially those deeply rooted in religion, blind trust replaced investigation. If a girl disappeared, if she came home broken, if she never came home at all, there was always a spiritual excuse. God has called her, or worse, she must have done something wrong. This collective denial wasn't just cultural, it was calculated. Institutions knew the power they held. They knew that as long as the public saw the convent as a place of discipline and purity, they could hide almost anything behind its walls, and they did. Justice in these cases didn't arrive on schedule. It stumbled, delayed by silence, shame, and fear. The few who dared to speak out were often ignored or punished. Many women who escaped tried to tell their stories only to be labeled unstable, bitter, or blasphemous. Some were threatened into silence. Others couldn't bear to relive what they had survived, but justice has a strange way of surfacing, even after decades of being buried. It started small. A former nun, now in her 70s, wrote a memoir. Just a self-published booklet at first. In it, she recounted the physical punishments, the emotional manipulation, and the unexplained disappearances she witnessed. Her words resonated like an earthquake beneath the surface of religious silence. Survivors came forward, journalists started digging, the public started asking questions that had been buried under incense and hymns for far too long. Still, resistance was fierce. Religious institutions had powerful legal teams, deep pockets, and political connections. Many of the abuses took place in private, without records, without witnesses, without any trail to follow. Statutes of limitations protected the accused. Even sympathetic law enforcement officers often hesitated to pursue cases involving churches or convents, fearing backlash or community outrage. And so, for years, the pursuit of justice felt like screaming into the void. But then something shifted. The culture began to change, as other scandals within religious institutions came to light, especially those involving child abuse and cover-up. Society began to look at sacred institutions with sharper eyes. Reverence gave way to scrutiny, and scrutiny made space for survivors to finally be heard. Laws began to change. Statutes of limitations for abuse were extended or removed in several states. Grand juries were convened, survivors banded together to file class action lawsuits, and most importantly, people started to believe them. Some convents were ordered to release old records. In some cases, what was found shocked even the most seasoned investigators: unmarked graves, forged documents, pregnancy records that didn't match any birth certificates, and psychological reports filed away like forgotten confessions. But still, many questions remain unanswered. Many convents have been demolished, many documents destroyed, many perpetrators have passed away, taking truth with them, and many victims. Too many never lived to see justice. So what do we do with that? We tell their stories, because justice isn't always found in courtrooms. Sometimes it's found in remembrance, in restoration, in refusal to look away again. We teach the next generation not to blindly revere institutions, but to question them. We emphasize transparency. We remind people that no robe, no habit, no holy title should ever be immune from accountability. And perhaps most importantly, we empower survivors, not just those from forbidden convents, but from anywhere that silence had reigned for too long. We show them what happens when one voice becomes two, then 10, then thousands. We show them that the long road to justice, though painful, is not a dead end. It winds, it delays, but it moves. Justice took too long, but it is coming, in books, in films, in confessions, in convictions, in the truth that no longer hides behind closed doors. The turn toward justice is not just about exposing the past, it's about shaping the future. A future where every institution, no matter how sacred, is answerable to the people it serves, and where every girl, no matter how voiceless she once was, knows that her story matters. Across America, in the overgrown woods and forgotten corners of once bustling towns, stand the crumbling remains of old convents, stone walls cracked by time, stained glass shattered, and vines claiming what silence left behind. These were places that once inspired awe and reverence. Today they whisper of something else: pain, secrecy, and lost voices. But what is perhaps more chilling than the stories of abuse, the hidden pregnancies, the punishments, and the whispers of ghostly cries in the night, is how long it took the world to listen. The reason this history still matters is not just because of the suffering it reveals. It matters because it uncovers something much larger: how institutions, when left unchecked, can twist virtue into violence, how control, dressed in religion, can become more terrifying than evil itself, and how silence can kill, not with knives, but with time. For decades, those young girls inside the convents had no one to run to. They were told their voices were sinful, that obedience was holy, that punishment was love, and in many cases they weren't just lied to. They were broken, and yet they survived. We must ask, why did no one question these places sooner? Why did parents, priests, bishops, and politicians allow them to operate in shadows? Why did the communities stay quiet? The answer is painful, but important. It lies in fear, faith, and familiarity. People were afraid to question the church. They feared eternal punishment. Many were raised to trust authority without question, and most couldn't imagine that something so horrifying could happen in a place that preached holiness. This history is not just about the past. It is a warning to the present. It teaches us that when we silence pain in the name of tradition, or dismiss suffering in the name of order, we become complicit in the darkness we fear. It teaches us that power, when hidden behind religious curtains, can corrupt absolutely, and that even the most sacred buildings can hold unspeakable secrets. But history also gives us something else. It gives us heroes, the Lillian Clarks, who ran through the woods barefoot and broken but lived to tell the truth. The Maria Benedicts, who wrote their pain into journals because they had no one to hear it. The Grace Martinses, who spent lifetimes searching for children stolen from them and never gave up. These women, once dismissed as hysterical, bitter, or forgotten, became the torchbearers of truth. They didn't just speak. They fought, they wrote, they testified, they sued. They forced the world to look at what it had been pretending not to see, and because of them, laws changed, institutions fell, and other women in other places found the courage to come forward too. Today, their stories are being taught in classrooms, filmed in documentaries, and honored by advocacy groups that help victims of religious trauma and institutional abuse. What was once buried is now being unearthed, sometimes literally, as in the case of the unmarked graves found beneath gardens and courtyards. But the work is not finished. Even now, there are places where silence rules, places where power hides behind sacred titles, places where children still suffer in the shadows, because no one wants to believe the light could be hiding something dark. So what do? We learn, we teach, we speak, we question, and above all, we believe the survivors. This keynote, this entire story, is not meant to demonize faith. It's meant to remind us that true faith is never afraid of the truth, that real holiness does not hide abuse, it exposes it. That silence, when it protects the powerful, is no longer spiritual, it's dangerous. Let this chapter of American history motivate us to build better institutions, to protect the vulnerable, to never be so loyal to a name or a structure that we forget the people inside it, and to raise children not to fear asking questions, but to be brave enough to find answers, because no convent, no church, no school, no institution should be above accountability, because every voice matters, because healing begins with truth, and because when survivors speak, the world must listen, not just to remember the past, but to protect the future.